Thank you so much, Mark, for inviting me. And I apologise, I'm interrupting your tea. I also apologise on behalf of the UK government for calling the committee, the Scientific Advisory Committee on Exotic Diseases. At my first meeting, I suggested they change the name in the spirit of post-colonialism, etc. But lots of my colleagues raised their eyebrows when I did that. But anyway, here we go. So I hope I'm talking to the brief. I'm going to talk about a couple of projects that I've been involved in. I'll be as quick as I can. Mark, please stop me if I'm going on. Let me see. Right. Okay. So I'm going to start thinking about, sorry for some of the language, but hopefully I'll keep the message as simple as possible. Obviously, we've had 75, 80 years of antibiotics and antimicrobials in our environment. We're used to the idea, of course, of these changing the very world. There's Hannah Landecker calls it the biology of history, if you like. The bugs aren't the same as they were 70 or 80 years ago. The bugs today, of course, are different. And so we're in this strange time, as Hannah Landecker calls it, of controlling prior modes of control, controlling the way in which we've learned to control infectious diseases. We've now got to control those. So my question, I guess, and I think it's a social science question, is how has control been imagined and enacted over the last 10 to 15 years once this issue has risen up the international agenda again, and with what effects? And I just want to start with that image as well. I was in the Lancet earlier this year of a kind of, you can't see the title, but basically this is the overall antimicrobial scores, the governance scores for antimicrobial resistance. And it's, you know, the green's good according to this, and of course it's a kind of global north versus global south kind of picture. I want to question some of that, of course, in terms of the ways in which these metrics are organized and understood through a couple of examples. Okay, so the AMR problem, I don't need to go over this too much. We did a special issue a few years ago with Claire Chandler and Helen Lambert, a couple of papers from that I've just highlighted here. Obviously high stakes, but also, of course, intrinsic uncertainty. Difficulties of measurement, not only in terms of how we measure, but also what we measure, low number of data points, especially when you move outside the clinical environment, complex pathways, latency in terms of delays, in terms of what we're doing to environments and our bodies, and then what effects that has later on, phenotypical and ecological variation, and I could, of course, go on. There's also one of the key issues that's come out the last few years of social science is a high dependency, of course. This is not necessarily about giving people, making them behavioral interventions where they have rational choices, if you like. There's a dependency, getting up, going to work, feeding or growing animals, etc., has become increasingly dependent upon antimicrobial compounds of one kind and another. So they're infrastructural, as Claire Chandler has reminded us on numerous occasions. So the AMR problem, I think, though, if you look at the history of it, especially since people like Dame Sally Davis here in the UK published The Drugs Don't Work and the various reports that came out of Cameron's coalition government, was stabilized, given that uncertainty, not necessarily the dependency issue, but given the uncertainty and so on, was stabilized through speculative economic assessment, behavioral and market-based incitements to manage uses. And some of that's about backing off from legal tools, if you like, because of the uncertainty and difficulties, especially in environment and animal sector, to these softer versions of controlling the means of control. That's a key issue, I think, for framing what I'm going to talk about. So controlling non-human use, I'm going to focus on the components of the, you know, there's lots of these diagrams that you can see. I won't go into any detail, of course, on that. I'm going to focus on the animals compartment of that diagram and its interrelation with environment more than the clinical setting. So controlling non-human use, basically we've got the emergence, persistence and transmission of antimicrobial resistant genes, and AMR more generally can occur within and across compartments. Globally, as you probably know, animal compartment is responsible for over half of antimicrobial consumption. And just because this is a One Health forum in some ways, of course, the quadripartite One Health aim is to reduce disease burden and inappropriate utilization of AMs. The key sector, of course, given the volume of use of antimicrobials, the effect this has on selection pressures and all the rest of it, and given the amount of that is not used for necessarily animal treatment, but maybe for growth promotion, but also for inappropriate kinds of treatments, then reducing the infectious burden for treatments and reducing inappropriate utilization is, of course, a reasonable and a valid goal. But I want to take two cases, one from work we've done in Bangladesh and then one from work we've been doing in the UK, to think about how that's being organized and raise some questions. I've not necessarily got the answers to this or what the alternatives are, but I think maybe that would come up in discussion. So control one, I'm just going to talk about the issue of modernization and our work in Bangladesh. Very briefly, we've been looking at aquaculture in Bangladesh, the second biggest export product from Bangladesh, so key for the national economy, but also, of course, key in raising nutrition levels, protein intake, and so on. Inland aquaculture is a massive issue in Bangladesh economy and rural life. I'm just going to focus on the shrimp and prawn sectors. Most of that occurs in the kind of coloured areas that you've got on that map. Interestingly, a lot of the hatcheries that produce the seed or fingerlings for that, not fingerlings, sorry, the post larvae for that industry is grown in Cox's Bazar, way down in the southeast of the country, and then shipped or flown actually to the farms in around the Sundarbans and north of there. Traditionally, people used to collect the larvae from the Sundarbans, from the kind of rivers, and put it in their farms. What we've got is a kind of cycling of disease, if you like, so a large issue in a kind of subtropical environment of a lot of disease. So what the idea of modernization here largely has been about modernizing the hatcheries so that they're not recycling disease into the farms and then the farms having to use a lot of treatments in order to deal with those. So you've got that kind of cutting the pathway, if you like, is the obvious and what seems on first value to be a very useful way of going about this. So you can see the back in black advert here is just one example of SPF or specific pathogen-free larvae for these shrimp and prawn being produced largely down in Cox's Bazar at some of the hatcheries anyway. The modernized ones, they receive NGO support from World Fish and funding from international organizations in order to produce these kinds of larvae, which are then shipped to the farms and the farms use. And that image of a farmer there is just one we went to. You can see there's more than shrimp in his catch there. Okay, so I just want to use that as a kind of basic holder, is that the way the farmers farm is kind of one of the issues here. But anyway, you've got the sense of a kind of modernization agenda in Bangladesh: reduce infectious burden and then reduce treatments, including potential use of antibiotics, often very inappropriate and poorly used antibiotics in water, and of course all the kind of pathways to humans and so on from that process. But before I get into it, I just want to say a little bit about the process. As a social scientist, what we do, of course, is try and understand the economy as well as the social life of people in these kinds of producer economies. And just let me use a very simple diagram. The farms on the left of that picture, there's about 200,000 shrimp and prawn farms in Bangladesh. So an awful lot of farms, relatively small and medium sized. They're rapidly commercializing. I think colleagues would call them missing middle farms. So they're not really tiny backyard, just small ponds. They're quite well organized farms. They're commercializing, starting to buy a lot of inputs and starting to intensify, if you like, and increasing every year, doing more of that. So they're commercializing rapidly. But it's nonetheless a relatively informal economy. This is a classic salvage accumulation situation where the big processes, the large capital firms, if you like, push all the risk back on. The biggest risk in this area is the grow out farms. Okay, that's where the risk is. And if your farm fails, the processor or exporter does rather well because there's 200,000 or 199,000, etc., other farms in order to get enough produce to provide your product for the international economy. So this is a kind of salvage accumulation, a lot of capital accumulated at the right-hand side of this diagram, the farms, etc., basically shouldering the burden of risk. And then there's a kind of semi-informal market of that accumulation. So farmers play this system, as we'll see, and make some money out of it. So we did a study with 300 farms in the southwest of Bangladesh, and did lots of survey work on disease outcomes and yields, etc. Built a bit of a model of what was going on, plus a lot of qualitative work with these farmers. We did focus groups, mapping exercises, all kinds of things. And just some of the highlights here. So the farm outcome data demonstrated that, of course, was a high disease burden, not surprising, with dependency on microfinance for stock purchase and pond maintenance. That's a key issue, of course, in lots of lower and middle income countries, of the rise of microfinance as a way of farmers and other economic producers making a living, but also pushing them into new forms of relatively small but nonetheless significant debt. Traditionally, since in the last 30 years or so, farmers have learned, because of this disease burden, to spread risk and income, basically by stocking every few months. So with the monsoon, the parameters of the pond change quite rapidly. So they suddenly go from quite salty to quite fresh water during the monsoon. You get changes of temperature, lots of other things going on. Of course, the ponds go up and down. So the farmers have learned to kind of deal with this by tinkering, if you like, with their farm mixing species, having multiple harvests. Part of the multiple harvests is about playing a kind of almost a spot market with rising and falling prices because of the production and so on. So once you've got a mix going on in those farms, you can do a pretty good job at kind of working out when it's best to harvest and so on. To realize the benefit of disease-free seed, though, what the farmers would do by the NGOs, including European ones as well as World Fish, were encouraged to adopt single batch stocking. Okay, so just stock at one point in the season, kind of February, March time, and then grow your crop. Basically don't include lots of other things, because the idea is that if you keep going into your pond in and out, adding things, taking things away, you're increasing the bioinsecurity risks, and a single harvest. So disease-free seed, the modernization agenda was to kind of have a European style aquaculture of reduced disease incidence. And what we found in our kind of models was that, yes, with this 300 sample, it did reduce disease incidence slightly. It's not surprising. You've got SPF fingerlings going on, you're going to have some marginal effect. But disease, of course, comes from lots of sources in this kind of environment. So the kind of headline, and I'll stop with this one, in this example, it's very quick, I know, but basically what disease-free farming or pathogen-free farming using these fingerlings involve changing routines, stocking practices and diversity. Technology doesn't just sort of land on a farm and kind of change everything. You also have to change a lot of social practices. Farmers had to repay their debts on a weekly basis. So telling them to only harvest once in this season meant that they couldn't service their debts, for example. Then you take away all the other species. If your shrimp crop failed, for example, you'd at least have some tilapia or maybe catfish or other things to kind of deal with. But taking those away, basically, you lost all the kind of vernacular insurance in this system. Okay, so livelihood risk increased. So yes, disease risk went down, but livelihood risk increased. And as lots of the farmers said in our focus groups, and when I asked them about, why do you use antimicrobials? Because they said they don't work very well, but basically they said, if we don't treat, we have nothing in this system. Okay. So I think the paradox here, because there's a lot of, as you probably know, a lot of modernization agenda saying it's these kind of small farms using kind of things in a non-regulated way. If only we could reduce disease and infection, we'd increase or reduce the burden of disease, and then reduce the potential use of or inappropriate use of antibiotics. But what we've shown, I think, is reducing disease incidence in these cases made treatments more rather than less likely. And without kind of change to the social system, the finance, the way in which farming is organized and so on, you've got this extractive salvage accumulation going on. You are basically setting up this kind of system to fail, and gone into a lot more detail about some of the social sciences about in the paper at the bottom corner. Okay, I want to go on to control and control 2, auditing. So social sciences have been interested in various kind of adjectival versions of society, one of which, we've got the risk society, all sorts of societies. One was the audit society, and I revisited this when I started to work again in the UK poultry system, which I've been working on for a few years, but with this time looking at AMR. And an audit society, to summarize Michael Power's formative work very quickly, is one where you've got high levels of organizational complexity, informational asymmetries, institutionalized distrust, public-private transformations, increasing marketization, which pushes control further into organizations rather than the state. So it's a rollback of the state, if you like, aligning organizations and public values and performativity and value for money, all of which I think describes in the UK anyway, probably in Australia and lots of other higher income countries, it describes the food system. Okay, we've got highly complex system, lots of informational asymmetries, farmers know stuff, vets know stuff, but the people, the buyers don't know stuff, etc. Massive distrust given the food scandals, etc., etc. So it's a good place, and of course audits, the process of auditing has become infrastructural to that system, as I'll go on to describe. UK poultry has grown in the last few decades to become the biggest meat source in the UK. We produce 13.5 billion eggs a year. And in the 2010s with AMR, retailers, processors and assurance schemes were positioned as key actors for AMR regulation within poultry, but also more generally within the livestock sector. Just a little diagram on the bottom there is from Brokel et al.'s work. I just use it because the chickens, that's the kind of, if you like, that kind of distribution is the kind of range in chickens of basically the number of micrograms of antimicrobials in this case it's 1 kilogram of chicken. So every kilogram of chicken you eat, it will have had that amount of antimicrobials in it. But you can see there's quite a long range, okay, from right down to the bottom to the organic sector, right up to near 300 milligrams per kilo. And so one of the aims of the audit that I'm going to describe was to lower that peak and also kind of move that long, larger tail into reduce that kind of long, the producers that were using a lot of antimicrobials in production. Okay, so just to give you a sense of what we did, just to focus on the diagrams for a minute, ignore the text, but you can see that in the British Poultry Council implemented this auditing scheme, stewardship of antibiotics. You can see it had a spectacular effect, actually, in particularly in chickens, but also turkeys and ducks in the UK, of reducing the amount of milligrams per kilogram in the chicken's case anyway, from around about 50 or so to below their target of 25 in basically an 8-year period. So it looks really successful in many ways. But what we wanted to do was ask, how does regulation touch down on the farms, in the poultry sheds, in bodies? We did lots of interviews and visits to farms and focus groups across UK livestock in a broader project. In this poultry sample I'm talking about, we also talked to all the main poultry vets in the UK and farming sectors across these various sectors. So there's a lot of words here, and I'm just going to go over them very quickly because this is qualitative work where we really had a long discussion about what was going on in farms. As you can see from the first quote, basically the farmers reflected that in the past they blanket medicated everything. Okay, so this was infrastructural antibiotics. Once you got your day-old chicks or your layers onto your farm, you basically dose them up. But they were told, you've got to stop, you've got to stop. So British Food Chain Assurance Scheme, for example, said, we will not allow it anymore. That's one of the first farmer. And so then the change in practice, of course, all good stuff, is that instead of just masking the problems with antibiotics, so if you had poor stock to start with, you gave them antibiotics to make sure they got through the race to the 2 kilos plus chickens by the end of 40 days. Basically now you've got this more conflictual situation of, well, if the chickens are wrong, the vet says, well, treat them, but then you've got your processors, who the kind of virtual consumers in this case, or the kind of auditors saying, well, we prefer if you don't treat them because we've got to justify those levels. And then the retailer kind of leaning down on putting downward pressure on the processor or the integrator in this case, to use less and less. So that's how the kind of pressure works in the system. And so farmers have had to change quite radically, and they're using digital systems to monitor treatments and so on, and to audit them on a kind of real-time basis. So what were some of the effects? Well, basically what we found is that there are compensatory control practices. So farmers haven't changed that radically. For the first few years, what they shifted was the kind of type of antibiotics they were using. So they shifted to fluoroquinolones, critically important antibiotics. That then kind of managed down because the British Poultry Council got wind of that, and the various assurance schemes put downward pressure on that. But nonetheless, that was the first example, basically more powerful antibiotics used. So you actually reduce the milligrams of active ingredient, but so you manipulate down the figures, but still using more serious use of antibiotics. And then when that got taken away in the poultry sector, as this quote says, we went through a really bad time with chickens. So basically the contract cleaners, these are the people who are bought in to kind of clean out sheds in between batches for the broiler production. They said, well, you've got to use formalin. That will get rid of everything. So the first cross, they washed it out and they got a massive pickup. So they're now using formalin, massive amounts of formalin in these poultry sheds. There's also chemicals that are kind of antibiotics, but not classed as them. So basically, you've got examples of products that will kill protozoa that are associated with coccidiosis, but they're classed still as feed additives. So there's a lot more of that going on as well, and they're picking up as well on farms. So there's compensatory control practices, some of which, of course, may well be associated with increasing resistance. So certainly in terms of the use of heavy metals within disinfectants and so on. Second point is a massive change in the role of diagnostics. This was a big issue for the O'Neill report in the UK around antimicrobials. If only we could diagnose it better, we'd get more appropriate use of drugs in both clinical and animal settings. And so you can see that the vets are not allowed to give prescription for birds. So we used to have empirical diagnosis, which basically vets would come, give lots of antibiotics. If the chickens got better, then you'd know it was bacterial. But now, of course, you've got to have the test. And one of the problems with the test is that they can take time if you're sending off to a lab, etc. So there's this emerging market for rapid tests, lateral flow devices, other kinds of things, as we'll see. So because this is high throughput business, even the layers, as you can see from this quote, feel the time pressure, but you can multiply that when you're in broilers. If you've got 40 days, waiting a few days for a test result is not an option. Nonetheless, there's still lots of professional judgment. So we never treat in isolation. These are words from vets. High levels of E. coli, for example, doesn't mean that they need treatment. We would also compare that to how the birds look and so on, and make those kinds of judgments. So there's still a lot of professional pride and judgment within the vets. It's kind of common issue that you find with clinicians as well as vets. And sometimes when the test says don't treat, you've got low levels of enterococcus, for example, it's better actually you do treat, because we know that the complications of not treating will be greater later. So sometimes the tests, if you like, and this is, we've written this up in more detail elsewhere, sometimes the tests are not definitive in terms of what to do. Nevertheless, returning back to power, a certain kind of administrative objectivity with that downward pressure from the retailers and processors is created and their logic is to standardize, and that prefers rules over these kinds of professional judgments and so on. So what's going on? I think what we noticed very quickly when we were in the field with this is that away from the diagnostic tests is that farmers were moving towards massive datafication, or farmers that could anyway. The other farms were being left behind. At the moment, everything's an interpretation of viewpoint, where if you've got those high-tech monitoring systems in place, it's far more informed decisions. So basically, you've got this farmer describing that they put sensors in all over the farm, measuring temperature, atmosphere, humidity, litter quality, all these kinds of things in order to kind of produce a much more complex map, including artificial intelligence, machine learning, all that's going on within the veterinary sector in order to kind of produce a kind of healthier environment in some ways. And although it's kind of a bit like herd health plans, where this farmer says it's a template that they tend to knock out, but nonetheless they tailor what's happened, what vaccines I've had, and so on, in order to kind of produce the next batch in a better way. So you've got this kind of emergence of a new object. It's not the bird anymore that they're worried about, it's the flock. And the flock becomes a kind of datafied object through which you can manipulate practices, etc., and produce a healthier outcome with lower use of treatments. Well, what I wanted to end with is just an observation that what we found when we were on farms that couldn't do this kind of work, they were off the Wi-Fi map, or they didn't have the money to implement this work in kind of producing a form of health that fitted into this, what Alex Blanchett calls the herd flock is constituted as abstracted genetics and probability across the whole breeding stock. What I just wanted to suggest, and I think it's not a one-way system, but what I wanted to suggest is what a lot of the kind of process I've talked about in this kind of audit-led process is that we move from health as adaptation of livestock to farm and environment, that kind of sense of health being, good enough to kind of cope with the things that are thrown at it, to health as a population-based standardized approximations to the norm. Okay, that's very much working on a kind of philosophy of health. And in some ways, what I would have liked to emphasize, there's more than one version of health going on, more than one health here. Like I've said before, that there's a kind of a version of health being produced in these kinds of environments. So, conclusions. Well, a book from many years ago called Fatal Remedies, I just want to focus on some of that. Modernization and audibility are kind of non-social fantasies of control in some ways. And what I think I'd like to emphasize is that they impose a normative biosecurity oriented object-based world onto a social and ecological issue. I'm not convinced that these reductions, however spectacular in antimicrobial uses, are sufficient to the resistant problem. And in fact, we may be producing a kind of form of agriculture that's part of the problem, not part of the solution. They offer then a kind of comforting governance of control, going back to that Lancet map. The areas that are coloured green have got lots of these systems in place, or emerging systems, but I think that's rather comforting. They lock us into practices, that's the lock-in of, I think my initial title, they lock us into practices that may actually contribute to the situation at hand. I think in the terms I've talked about, they reduce the diversity of livestock practices at a time when we need to explore other versions of doing interspecies or One Health, if you like. Just to make, there's lots of people to thank. I don't do this on my own. There's lots of other great people I work with. And very unfortunately, I lost my lovely colleague, Henry Buller, early in the year, who was very much involved in part of this work. So that's to Henry. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.